It was a hot, humid day in Ellis County, Texas on July 29th, 1993. Only those who had to be were outdoors working. A road crew member smoothing the gravel on Cutoff Road that afternoon noticed something white lying about 100 feet in the thick foliage not far from the bridge over Smith Creek. Whatever it was, the object was clearly out of place. He and another man climbed over barbed wire and brushed past the brambles and thorns. Soon, they smelled an offensive odor, and then saw that the form was human, nude and female, lying partially on her back. One of the men watched over the body while the other went to the nearby town of Tellico to call the police. What neither had noticed at first, but had seen as they'd drawn closer, was that she was missing both her head and her hands. The police arrived quickly to remove the corpse, which, from the amount of bloating and decomposition, appeared to be a day or two old. They assumed, writes Bill Cox in Born Bad, that the killer had removed the head and hands to prevent identification. Possibly he didn't know much about the new science of DNA analysis and might have assumed that without fingerprints or a face, no identification was possible. But they were in for another shock. While searching for the missing body parts, investigators came across another body. Nearly 300 yards from the girl lay the fully clothed body of a young male, clearly no older than 15. He was face down on the creek bank, 20 feet or so from the bridge. He hadn't been dismembered. This body was difficult to reach, so the Tellico Volunteer Fire Department assisted with the removal, and a team of investigators remained in the mosquito-infested area to go over the crime scene until it was too dark to see. An autopsy at the Dallas County Medical Examiner's Office, which served a number of Texas counties, indicated that the boy had been shot twice in the head with a .22 caliber weapon, and the girl had been shot in the back with a similar weapon and stabbed multiple times. Her head had been removed at the base of the neck with either a hunting knife or an axe, and there was a lot of damage to her remains that indicated that the killer had stayed with the body for quite a while. The medical examiner, Dr. Sheila Spotswood, thought it was among her worst cases. She said on a Forensic Files documentary devoted to the case, where someone had this much mutilation after death. On top of the dismemberment, the female victim had extensive wounds on her abdomen, thighs, and genital area, some of which appeared to be intricate carvings. There was a long, deep cut through her stomach that looked almost like an autopsy incision. In fact, it seemed that her killer had reached into the stomach with his knife to stab at other internal organs like the liver. Both of the victim's nipples had been cut off. There were numerous bruises on her body, and where she'd been eviscerated, her intestines had been pulled out and exposed. At the place where the hands had been severed, some bruises suggested the use of handcuffs. It seemed to be a sexual crime, since her clothes had been removed, but there were no clear signs of sexual assault, either on the body or at the crime scene. While decomposition prevented the definitive analysis, it looked to Spotswood more like a crime of extreme hatred or anger than rape or murder. There was also an element of fascination with the corpse, otherwise known as necrophilia. Samples of fly larvae on both bodies, as stated in reports from the Attorney General's office, provided an estimate of time of death as being 2 days before, between the evening of July 26th and the morning hours of July 27th. Insects had obliterated some of the wound openings, but the medical examiner believed she had an accurate read on what had caused them. Nevertheless, she enlisted the assistance of forensic entomologist Dr. Neil Haskell in Illinois for a second opinion. Insects were his specialty, and he set to work to recreate the conditions in his lab for a scientific analysis. Cox points out that, given what they had, they faced a real puzzle. Why remove the head and hands of one victim, but not the other? Perhaps the mutilation had nothing to do with hiding identities. Maybe there was something darker going on. But what? Solving this puzzle could help them with the motive, but they also realized that perhaps the boy's body had fallen to a point where the killer could not easily have gotten to it, and thus had no choice but to leave. This victim may have been spared the indignity simply by chance. The lack of clear answers was maddening. Looking for the girl's clothing and for other evidence of the killer after the bodies were removed, detectives came across a barb on a barbed wire fence that had caught several long blonde hairs. They collected these as possible belongings to the girl, since it was clear that to leave her where she was, the killer had crossed over this fence from the road. For her, they had no clothing or identifying features to work with, so they searched the boy for some form of identification. They got lucky. In his pocket was a black wallet with a library card from Terrell, a town in the adjacent county, bearing the name James B. King. They now had a lead, but it might have to wait until the library opened the next day. A few calls that night to local police departments came up with missing persons reports on 2 kids from the tiny town of Garrett, a boy and a girl. The boy's name was Brian King. It didn't take long to find his family. Brian King was from Garrett, Texas, some 30 miles southeast of Dallas. Detectives went there that night and showed James King, Brian's father, the wallet retrieved from the boy. He confirmed that it had belonged to his 14-year-old son who was missing. He believed that the girl that they had found might be his stepdaughter, 13-year-old Christina Benjamin, who was also missing. They asked him if he'd seen anything suspicious. According to a statement issued by the Texas Execution Information Center, King said that 3 nights earlier, around midnight, something woke him, a car. It had honked twice near the house and then driven away. Brian, he knew, was sleeping outside in a hammock, something he'd never done before. So when it sounded like the vehicle had returned, he looked outside and saw that a tan car had pulled up, turned off its lights, and parked near the house. That roused King from bed, and he went to the front door to investigate. He saw that Brian was talking to someone inside and figured it must be one of Brian's friends. Someone in the back seat had long, light-colored hair with a fuzzy texture. He couldn't see the driver. Not yet concerned, he went to the bathroom, but when he came back, Brian and the car were both gone. He waited for an hour, but Brian didn't return. King decided to go back to bed and speak to his son in the morning about this unusual behavior. But Brian did not come home that night or the next morning. When the family searched the house, they realized that Christina was also missing. Calls were made to people they knew, but neither of the children could be located. King and his wife went out searching on their own, but turned up nothing, so after another day, they filed a missing persons report. Christina's younger sister, who slept in the same room with her, offered some intriguing information. Apparently, Brian had come in to wake Christina to urge her to sneak out. It had sounded prearranged. While the possibility of some kind of drug deal retaliation was discussed among the investigators, it became clear after talking with the parents that these were good kids who were usually obedient and didn't make a habit of sneaking away. Brian had been bored lately, but there was no evidence that he was hanging out with the wrong crowd. Everyone who knew him liked him. Photographs of Christina showed her to be a blonde with long hair, so investigators asked for samples of her hair to compare with what they'd found on the barbed wire fence. They received her hairbrush, around which strands of blonde hair were wound. The family also provided an X-ray of a recent injury to Christina's foot from an accident at school. Investigators took these items to be analyzed, but felt sure that they'd learned the identity of their Jane Doe. 2 kids had gone out one night for a lark, only to meet an unexpected fate that would turn out to be more twisted and evil than anyone yet imagined. The X-ray of Christina's ankle injury provided a match to what the medical examiner had discovered about the corpse at the autopsy. However, they didn't find a match between her hair and the blonde hair found on Brian King's trousers. That meant it could have come from the killer. I looked at the fiber on the male victim's shoe using transmitted light microscopy, Lynch said on Court TV's Forensic Files. I've seen those types of carpet fibers before, usually from Japanese vehicles, so that was my communication to the police, that it may be from a tan vehicle of Japanese make. The last time Brian King was seen alive, he'd entered what his father described as a tan car. Thus, if they found the car, they had a possible physical link between Brian and his killer. What seemed most ominous about the case was the fury with which the killer had attacked Christina. Unless it was a specific revenge killing, it suggested that this person was going to kill again. Asking around, investigators learned from neighbors that on the night the two disappeared, they had intended to go out with a boy named Jason. No one seemed to know his last name. Then they learned that people had seen a young man, currently working as a roofer, carrying a pistol. Another man, Christopher Nolan, was questioned about his association with the two kids, and he admitted knowing them. When asked if he knew who might have done such a crime, he offered a name: Jason Massey. He knew of a plan involving Massey going to Christina's house on some night in July, honking twice, and then meeting her after midnight. Nolan thought Jason Massey was weird and knew he had a history of mutilating animals and keeping their heads as trophies. He'd watched Massey kill a calf, and Massey had told him once that if he ever heard about a serial killer in the area, it would be him, Massey. He liked to brag about things like that. To the police, that sounded like the type of person they were looking for. They started asking questions about Jason Massey's background. Jason Massey had long blonde hair. He was a high school dropout, age 20, and the child of a transient substance abuser who moved from one tenement to another. He'd been born in 1973 to a single mother who neglected him to go into bars and often beat him with a belt or paddle. His mother fed herself before him and hid food in her room, according to what Carol Ann Davis discovered and what was said at the trial. So Jason and his younger sister lived with constant need. The family moved frequently, even living in a car at times. So when Jason came across those who were weaker, he reversed his role from victim to victimizer, a typical progression for males. He beat younger kids and tortured cats. By his early teen years, he was drinking alcohol excessively and taking drugs. Jason turned out to have a record of petty crimes, stalking, and animal abuse. He tried befriending a girl, and when she showed little interest, he allegedly killed her dog to teach her a lesson. Earlier in 1993, the police had stopped him for suspected intoxication, finding a cat in his car with a noose around its neck. Cox says it was alive, other statements said it was dead, and a number of sharp tools. Massey was sentenced to 120 days in jail, but got out early enough to be a suspect in the murders. And that wasn't all. A couple of days before the discovery of the bodies, said Lieutenant Royce Gothard, Ennis police had received a call about a calf that had been mutilated behind the McDonald's. When they arrived, they found an abandoned 1982 tan Subaru and a bracelet on the ground engraved with the name Jason. Someone had run from the scene, who was soon identified as Jason Massey. With all these indicators pointing to him, investigators decided to bring Massey in for questioning. Massey was arrested and charged with capital murder. When the handcuffs were over his wrists, he offered a broad smile, as he also did for his mugshot. Cox writes that the police involved thought that no one could remember when a suspect had ever looked happier. To them, it seemed strange. They got a search warrant to go into Massey's residence, where they found newspaper clippings about the murders, a stash of pornography, a knife box, and handcuffs that appeared to have traces of blood on them. Books that indicated an interest in satanic cults and in police procedure were also found, as were a few articles of female clothing. Searching Massey's suspiciously clean Subaru, they found tiny bloodstains in the car and on a knife and hammer, all of which they collected for analysis. They also found duct tape, electrical tape, and more blonde hairs, and a leaf that appeared to have blood on it. Confiscating the car, they removed it to the lab for the specialist to go over for blood tests, trace evidence, and fiber analysis. Then they went to talk with Massey, who was sitting in jail. They showed him photos of the crime scene, asking him to look at Christina and pressuring him to put himself back into that night. His response, reenacted on forensic files, was to gag in such a way that implied guilt to them and knowledge of the crime. They asked him about his earlier arrest and the rumors of his cruelty to animals. He denied the allegations and said he didn't know either of the victims, but then provided a hypothetical location for the body parts they were trying to find. He even took them out to show them what he meant, but after hours of searching in the woods, they came back with nothing. After that, Massey asked for an attorney, and that was the end of his questioning. Then came an anonymous call to the Ellis County Sheriff's Office. The caller said that they should be looking for a boy named Jason Massey. He called again with an attorney and said that he'd known Jason in Dallas and had a lot to tell. He was questioned for later use in court. Searching for more witnesses to piece together a timeline for Jason Massey leading up to the estimated time of the murders, they found a girl, Christina Irwin, who resembled Christina Benjamin and who had seen Massey most of the evening on the night of July 26th. He'd left her, she said, sometime after 11 o'clock. She thought he'd been acting strangely. Her sister told police she'd seen Jason with a pistol and a box from Walmart containing handcuffs. A Walmart clerk who remembered items like this picked Jason Massey out of a lineup as the person to whom he'd sold .22 caliber bullets, 2 knives, and a pair of handcuffs on July 22nd. It also turned out that Massey's cousin owned a .22 caliber pistol, which he'd left at his grandmother's house, accessible to Massey, and which was now missing. Massey's picture was printed in the newspaper, and the owner of a car wash came forward to say that late in July, he'd seen the boy throwing something into his trash bin around 11:30 one night. The boy had then backed up his tan Subaru to leave, but he realized he was being watched, and so he'd pulled up to a car vacuum to clean out his car. Police went to where the bin had been dumped and went through the contents from the car wash vacuum. Altogether, they recovered a payroll slip with Massey's name on it and a red bandana with blonde hair stuck to it. Finally, the lab results were in. The rug fiber found on Brian's shoe proved to be significantly similar under a microscope to the fibers from Massey's tan car, as did the blonde hairs from the bandana and the one picked off of Jason's clothing. DNA testing using the PCR method matched the blood from Massey's car seat and other areas, along with the knife, handcuffs, leaf, and hammer taken from the car, to Christina Benjamin. The odds that only she was the source of origin were good enough for court. They believed that she might have been transported in the car while bleeding. There was also a blood clot on a clump of hair that had been found on the ground where her head could have been before it was removed. That too proved to be highly likely to be related to the blood in the car. The hair from that clump was also microscopically linked to the hair strands caught on the barbed wire fence, hair from Christina's brush, and a strand of hair found in Massey's car. The FBI then confirmed the fiber analysis. Entomologist Neil Haskell checked in with his results. The insect evidence taken from the bodies indicated that the deaths had occurred any time from midnight on July 26th until the next morning, a 10-hour time span. Things were adding up, both physically and circumstantially, and no one was giving Massey an alibi. Most people to whom he'd revealed his dark side seemed to think he was strange or even frightening. A 9th grade teacher, Edith Robinson, had told police that Massey had been obsessed with swastikas and morbid images and often talked about killing. His idol was Charles Manson, the man who had urged his gang out to commit 2 episodes of mass murder. He carried around an article about Manson and always placed it on his desk to look at as if for inspiration. According to Cox, Jason had told her that Manson might have had a good reason to kill people, which would make his crimes acceptable. When she had a meeting with him and his mother, she noticed that the mother was rather abusive. Jason had also indicated to her that 1993 would turn out to be as important as 1969, the year of the Manson murders. Between this, the reports of repeated animal abuse, and the people who said that Jason was always talking about killing girls, the police believed they had a real monster on their hands. Yet they still didn't have a clear motive for the double homicide, so they consulted with the FBI's Behavioral Science Investigative Support Unit, providing them with a full description and photos of the crime and crime scene. The FBI profilers told DA Joe F. Grubb that these murders had not been sexually motivated. That surprised Grubb, since the girl was nude and her clothing was taken from the scene. But the profilers insisted that this person had other motives and said they should be looking for someone who might have a history of abusing animals. Grubb knew that's exactly what they had. The profilers went on to describe the killer as organized, antisocial, and fitting the typical behavioral profile of what they would call a lust murderer. What excited him was torture and mutilation, and possibly even a bit of necrophilia. Such people were driven by violent fantasies, and when opportunity and tension crossed paths, the result was usually destructive. This person would abuse circumstances and would have a car and be fairly mobile. He'd collect weapons and take souvenirs from the crime scene. He'd also attend to the media coverage and collect articles about his crimes. The motive was typically wrapped up in rejection, hostility towards society, and an erotic attraction towards violence. In short, it was a thrill kill fueled by rage. The target was the girl. The boy just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time and was probably killed first. That appeared to fit what they already knew about Jason Massey. Investigators also learned that in June 1991, Dr. Kenneth DeCleva, a state psychiatrist, had examined Massey at the request of his mother, who had come across 2 notebooks that contained Massey's journals kept since 1989. She was disturbed by their violent content, especially the list of names of girls he wanted to kill and wanted her son evaluated. DeCleva read and copied the journals, which had been kept over the past 6 months, and learned that Jason had an obsessive fantasy life and was enamored of the idea of becoming a serial killer. In fact, he described it as a sacred journey. He listed specific girls he wanted to rape and kill as a way to engrave his name on society. Apparently, he wanted to reap as much sorrow and suffering on others as he could. He described himself as a student of police procedure, ensuring that when he finally got around to committing these crimes, he would know ways to avoid getting caught. As DeCleva made his way through these journals, it was apparent to him that Massey had actually made plans and purchased weapons, turning fantasies into action, which increased the danger that he would act out and possibly kill someone. While it's difficult to predict when someone is truly a threat, these are among the signs that make a threatened action more likely to happen than not. DeCleva concluded that Massey did indeed pose a threat to others and might even be suicidal. Massey was committed to the Dallas Psychiatric Intensive Care Unit for further observation, although DeCleva knew that there was no real treatment for antisocial personality disorder. Other doctors examined the young man, 18 at the time, but they didn't agree with DeCleva's prognosis, so Massey was released. Yet DeCleva still had the journals, and they confirmed for prosecutor Clay Strange what the FBI analysts had said. Massey wanted to kill just for the sexual thrill. In fact, he'd been obsessed with it for several years. On March 17, 1994, Jason Massey was indicted on 2 counts of capital murder, to which he pleaded not guilty. In his letters from prison, he expressed his belief that he'd soon be free again and without restraint. The prosecutor's team worried over that possibility. The trial would hinge on just how well they could teach the jury about scientific analysis and then weave it into the circumstantial evidence. Given the short history of DNA analysis and the fact that class evidence, like fibers, couldn't be definitive, things could still go wrong. After 3 weeks, a jury was seated and the prosecution team said it would seek the death penalty in this case. The defense asked for a change of venue, which was denied, and on September 28, 1994, the testimony began. Clay Strange's opening statement summarized the case. Massey was introduced to Christina Benjamin in mid-July 1993. He told the friend who introduced him that he wanted to kill her. Toward that end, he stole a gun and bought ammunition, knives, and handcuffs. He formed a plan to get her out of the house, and on July 26, 1993, around midnight, put that plan into operation. He lured both children into his car, took them on a ride, killed Brian, and then killed Christina, mutilating her body. They had hair, fiber, and blood evidence that would physically link Massey to the murders, along with witnesses who would fill in the gaps. Court-appointed defense attorney Mike Hartley accused the state of an incomplete investigation, leaving out other potential suspects. He also pointed out that the physical evidence was based on probability and was not conclusive. He believed his client, Jason Eric Massey, would be exonerated rather than convicted by the evidence the state would present. Those witnesses whom the state would use were of such disreputable character that their testimony could be shown a way to deflect attention from themselves. Some of them once had been suspects, and 2 had a grudge against his client. It was clear that more than one person was in the car on the night of the murder, and anyone else who was there might have been the killer. Then the principals involved, the parents, investigators, medical examiner, and entomologist, provided their testimonies about the night of the murders. After that, it was time for the criminalists and biologists to explain their analysis to the jury. Finally came the other witnesses. Chris Nolan, in a prison jumpsuit from a parole violation, explained how he'd been with Jason when they met Christina. He'd been riding in a car with Massey about 10 days before the murders, according to reports from the Attorney General's office, and convinced him to drive over to see Christina, who was a friend of his. He'd noticed Massey and Christina flirting, and they talked about sneaking out together some night. Massey's plan had been to come by around midnight one night and honk his horn. That would be the signal for her to go to the old Phoenix station on I-45 and wait. Massey had told Nolan that he planned to rape the girl, mutilate her with a knife, and kill her. But then, Nolan said, Massey talked about killing girls all the time, so Nolan paid no attention to the comment. It was weird. On cross-examination, Hartley decided to use Nolan's history of substance abuse to undermine his character. He also pointed out that Nolan and his friend Mark Gentry had it in for Massey for approaching Gentry's former girlfriend. Nolan admitted that this was correct, doing his testimony some damage. Then the girls who'd seen Jason's gun took the stand, as did the Walmart clerk who had sold him the items of interest. A former classmate from 7th grade, Anita Mendoza, told the court that as early as 1989, and on and off after that, Massey used to make threatening phone calls to her, harassing her with vile language and notes, and telling her that he had dreams about killing her. In fact, her dog had been killed and mutilated in her driveway one day after she refused to meet him, its blood smeared on her car. She believed he had done it. He'd also sent her a magazine photograph of a woman that he'd beheaded with scissors, telling her that this was what she would eventually look like. She read sections of his shocking letters to the jury, which effectively illustrated how he equated obsessive sexual violence with love. Then letters that Massey had written while in prison to a girl confined for mental problems were read to the court. In one, he said that he wanted to grab society by the throat and shake them with terror until they're awake and realize what's up, so they'll remember who I am, when and why I came their way. Jason noted that July 26, 1994 marked 1 year since it all happened. That seemed ominously to point to murder, but Hartley got Jason's mother to explain that on July 27, 1993, the day after the murders, Jason had gone to a revival meeting and been saved. However, Clay Strange effectively proved that her son had exhibited decidedly unchristian thoughts and behavior since his rebirth, which didn't rattle her, but had the intended effect on the jury. Then Hartley grilled the lead investigator to get him to admit that Jason Massey had been the primary suspect from the start and that no one else had ever been investigated. The other man or men in the car that night were never identified. This could place reasonable doubt in the minds of the jury, despite the physical evidence that had mounted against his client. Hartley might well have found some ground for doubt had it not been for a momentous discovery that occurred just before that phase of this bifurcated trial closed. In fact, in the middle of Strange's dramatic closing argument, one of his team was called out of the courtroom. It could only have been for an emergency. A hiker walking through the woods came across a scuffed and rusty red cooler. Opening it, he was shocked to find the decapitated skeletonized heads of several dozen animals, 31 in all. With them, bagged in plastic, were 4 red and yellow spiral notebooks full of handwriting. In crooked, evil-appearing script, they were labeled The Slayer Book of Death, Volumes 1 to 4, The Thoughts of Jason Massey. The hiker knew enough about the case to realize that this was an important piece of evidence, so he called the police. Jason Massey's trophy cooler. The journal entries began in 1989 and ended in 1993, the month in which the kids had been murdered. Inside, among other things, Massey described the episode in which he'd killed the dog of a 7th-grade girl, probably Anita Mendoza, smearing the blood on her car. He'd never been arrested for it, but now it was clear that he'd done it. His other desires directly reflected the precise acts committed against Christina Benjamin. It was like a signature. Personality determines behavior, and one's fantasies will likely match one's actions. After reading them, there was no doubt among the prosecutors about how thoroughly obsessed Massey had been for years with murder and torture. He wanted to become a murder machine. On October 6, 1994, while the prosecution team was going through the journals for the next phase of the trial, the jury took just 3 hours to convict Jason Eric Massey of both murders. Some sources say 1 count, some say 2, and Massey's appeals claim that it was only 1, and he rails against those people who believed mistakenly that it was 2. Cox's book suggests that it was 1, but the trial took the jury through the double murder, piece by piece, never emphasizing only 1 victim. Before the penalty phase was to begin the next day, Strange's staff copied over 500 pages from Massey's death journals. Then they prepared a statement to get the jury ready for what they were about to see and hear. First, there was the opening of the cooler, which gave forth a terrible stench, and the removal of several of the skulls. This cooler had been discussed earlier in the trial because Massey's acquaintances knew about it, and now here it was. The man who'd found them, who had once been a neighbor to the defendant, acknowledged in court that he'd made this discovery. Then, Paul DeMomio, the young man who'd made the anonymous call during the early stages of the investigation, came forward to talk about his experience with Jason Massey. They'd taken drugs together and talked about raping girls. He'd killed animals with Massey and even assisted in an armed robbery. He was now a student getting counseling and living a good Christian life. When he'd heard about the murders, he'd called to tell the police to look for Jason Massey. He also identified Massey's handwriting in the Slayer books of death. It was the road he'd been on, and Massey had even considered him to be a killing partner like Henry Lee Lucas had, but family and friends had turned him around. Then Dr. DeCleva identified what he knew of the journals, since he'd read 2 of them. He believed that Massey was not a good candidate for rehabilitation. Dr. Clay Griffith, a forensic psychiatrist who had read through the journals, letters, and Dr. DeCleva's report, concurred. He said that Massey's form of antisocial personality was too severe to ever successfully treat and would probably not diminish with age. He would always be a danger. An FBI profiler took the stand to say the same thing. Then it came to the journal entries, which detailed Massey's intent to become a famous killer. In these pages, it was clear that Massey had picked out one young girl after another, all between the ages of 10 and 13, to be his first. He'd claimed undying love for them and the need to possess them, which he could only do if he killed them. Christina Benjamin had just been one of many, and Massey had apparently been responding to some inner demon that reacted badly when girls rejected him. They had to die. It was also clear that he was determined to do what he claimed he would do, because that was a way to be a man, and he needed to be the best at whatever he set out to do. Apparently, he'd attempted murder before, but had failed at it. That hadn't sat well with him. In part, this was related to his hatred towards his mother and his desire to kill her. In part, it seemed to be influenced by a grandmother who insisted that he had to make his mark. Ultimately, his violence welled up from that feeling that the master, Satan, was watching him at all times. He wanted to do something significant, like an all-out massacre. He worried that if he didn't act soon, God would come and take his girls away from him. The defense, somewhat unprepared for this blow to their case, nevertheless managed to use the journals to some benefit, showing passages where Massey described being lonely, having doubts, and wanting to turn away from all this and be good. He described being sexually abused by a babysitter when he was around 5 and being hit by a father who'd left him and his mother when he was 2. Hartley hoped he could drum up a little sympathy. He also put Jason's sister on the stand to describe their difficult lives as children, But this backfired when the prosecution got her to say that despite all that, she'd been able to live an upstanding life. The prosecutors relied on Massey's own words from his journal to prove the aggravating circumstances that would show a depraved mind. Massey had kept track of his animal abuse, killing 41 cats, 32 dogs, and 7 cows, removing their heads to keep with him to remind him of his violence. The evidence was right there in the courtroom. It was clear that had he not been stopped in July 1993, he would have killed again. His greatest ambition, he wrote in these books, was to become America's most famous serial killer. My goal is 700 people in 20 years. Some sources put that number at 1,000. After only 15 minutes on October 12, 1994, the jury decided on the death penalty. Before sending him to death row in Huntsville, the judge told Massey that his death would be more humane than the deaths he'd inflicted on his victims. On his way to death row, Massey said that he'd placed Christina's head and hands in a pillowcase with her clothes and thrown them into the Trinity River. No one believed him because it was inconsistent with his previous behavior with animals. He liked his trophies. They figured he'd buried these objects in the woods somewhere. Massey was surprised to have been convicted at all, and he was not about to just give up. During the appeals process, Massey fought to have his trial transcripts reviewed, claiming that he'd been found guilty of only 1 count of capital murder and should not therefore be eligible for the death penalty. He issued statements to online websites to the effect that his attorney was incompetent and was trying to get me killed by default. People fighting on his behalf, such as the Canadian Coalition Against the Death Penalty, claimed that other suspects were never investigated properly, that one witness had seen more than one person in the car that Brian King had entered on the night of his murder, and that the prosecution's expert evidence technician was a man with a record of mental illness, alcohol, and drug abuse. They also said that the defense had failed to hire anyone to testify as to Jason's state of mind at the time of the crime, and they did not get adequate funding for their own DNA analysis. Not only that, the judge, they claimed, appeared bored and disinterested throughout the proceedings, and the search warrant that had produced some of the significant items was questionable. The case went to the appeals court on 24 separate counts of trial error. These were thrown out on the grounds that the submitted record was inaccurate and incomplete. Massey gave interviews from prison, telling a reporter from the Ennis Daily News that he'd changed. As we grow, we change. I have a lot of anger about the stupid mistakes I made, and at the same time, I recognize anger is just an emotion. There's no explanation as to why this indicates that he's no longer a danger. Then it was over. All of his appeals were exhausted, and none had worked. Execution Room, Huntsville, Texas. On the evening of April 3, 2001, Massey was taken to the execution chamber and strapped to a gurney. Before he was executed, he offered his final words in a statement. Strapped to the death chamber gurney, he looked directly at Christina's family and said, "I do not know any of y'all, and that's unfortunate, because I would like to apologize to each and every one of you individually. I can't imagine what I've taken from you. I want you to know I did do it. I'm sorry for what I've done. I want you to know that Christina did not suffer as much as you think she did. I know you guys want to know where the rest of her remains are. I put her remains in the Trinity River." Then he turned to his parents and grandmother and said to them, "All of this pain has brought us closer together, and all of this suffering that we've been through brought us closer to the Lord, and in the end, that is what counts. Tonight I dance on the streets of gold. Let those without a sin cast the first stone." As the lethal drug was injected, Massey recited a biblical verse. He gasped slightly, and 8 minutes later, at 6:20 p.m., he was pronounced dead. Jason Eric Massey was just 28 years old. Although another search was made along the riverbanks, Christina's head and hands were not recovered. "It's impossible to assign a motive to a case like this," said Clay Strange in an interview. "I think he did it because it was pleasurable to him. He's as evil as anybody I've ever encountered. I've met a lot of people meaner, but no one more evil." He was only 20 when he committed these crimes. How did he become so depraved? Cox includes numerous entries from Massey's repetitive death journals in Born Bad, but he doesn't offer much in the way of insight. Let's examine the influences and circumstances. In the entry for January 19, 1991, a Sunday, Massey writes that he tried and failed to kill his girlfriend, and "I'm tired of feeling like shit for not being able to kill." 3 days later, he made a notation that officially marked his sacred journey. His master was Satan, who had called out to him in the woods, and Massey believed that once he began, he would be unable to stop. How can we understand a young mind that would engage in extreme fantasies of mutilation and torture, devise a campaign of death, and view as sanctified his development into a serial killer? Is this just some aberrant individual, or might there be others like him in the making? His case provides a good study for criminology. Psychoanalyst and social philosopher Erich Fromm writes about the development of malignant aggression in The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, and his ideas clarify how some people turn toward the need to harm. They're guided by a set of values, and those values come from character, which is influenced in its development by social circumstances. Certain people appear to crave absolute control, evident in Massey's journals, and this need often derives from a chaotic childhood. The natural instinct of benign aggression, Fromm says, comes from the automatic need to protect oneself and to survive, whereas malignant aggression is not psychological in nature. Rather, it's a failure of character rooted in human passion. It's about existential need, or the desire to make a distinct mark on one's world. Whether a person will make that mark in a pro-social or antisocial way is largely influenced by how his social circumstances interact with his psychological constitution. If his urge is to leave his mark destructively, the extremes of that drive are sadism, the passion for unrestricted power over another person, and necrophilia, an attraction to all that's dead. Fromm believes that we all have an inner drive to make sense of life and to experience it to its optimum intensity. Even people inclined towards evil are trying to make sense of their lives to organize an otherwise chaotic existence. Yet, paradoxically, they use their own lives to turn against life itself. Necrophilia itself, says Fromm, is both real and symbolic. It's a yearning for life to finish itself. Such people often have dreams about dismembered parts, which are interpreted as their desire to tear apart living structures. These people desire a world where there's no life, and their drive for absolute control makes them increasingly more dangerous. They have to control via death. We can see how this applies to Jason Massey, who clearly wanted people around him to die, who wanted to tear their bodies apart, and who wanted control over others to the point of owning their bodies. "All I want," he wrote, "is the murdering of countless young women." The real question is, how did he get this way? Children who grow up without stability, as the published accounts say he did, have difficult forming emotional attachments to their caretakers. Jason, who never knew his father, was deprived, beaten, and forced to live in an environment of uncertainty and random violence at the mercy of a narcissistic mother who had children by accident and who treated them as if they were a bothersome appendage. Not only did she create a transient and unpredictable environment, she added to it with neglect, starvation, and punishment. It should come as no surprise that Jason would develop a love-hate relationship with women. Jason's mother, just like all self-absorbed mothers, never saw what she was creating. That her care of him was filled with cruelty, unpredictability, and little emotional involvement meant that she was molding him in her own image. First, she was an influential role model who showed her children that violence was the way to resolve life's problems. Second, she inspired in at least one of her children the feeling that he had to create his own center of stability, and for a male, that meant finding some image that would make him feel powerful rather than weak. Third, she kept her family in Texas, a place where the image of manhood does involve an aggressive sense of control. While Jason was viewed as a monster, in some ways, he never really had a chance. As the only child for 2 years, he took the brunt of his mother's immaturity, and as a loner rejected by other kids, he developed a need to find something that would comfort him and make him stronger on his own. While this kind of parenting and childhood experience would not necessarily cause someone to look to serial killers as the source of power, it apparently had some influence on Jason's selection of what gave his life meaning. Feeling angry and afraid, he developed violent fantasies, and his image of women was formed by an ill-tempered mother who was anything but nurturing. When he learned from experience that violence against others made him feel powerful, it was inevitable that his fantasy life would become more textured with these images, especially as he moved through puberty. Since he was heterosexual, girls would naturally become the objects of his fantasies of domination and control. He roamed the woods in search of his own private cemetery for his victims. He viewed himself as serving some master and built altars to a demon. He killed animals out here under the moon and became obsessed with specific girls he saw. He even wrote that he wanted to decapitate a girl and have sex inside her neck. Thus, he would gravitate towards others who had found the same kind of solace or solutions in violence, notably people such as Charles Manson, Ted Bundy, and Henry Lee Lucas, whom he later got to meet on death row. All he needed to do was watch how the media nearly deified such people with endless hype and attention, how serial killers were made to look clever and calculating in movies. They were somebody. And if he became one, he'd no longer be a nobody, a poor boy with nothing. He, too, would be somebody. In fact, he'd not only become a serial killer and achieve some of that glory, he'd become America's most notorious serial killer. Everyone would remember him. People would write about him. He'd be in criminology textbooks and be offered as an example of real dangerousness. Thoughts like that were powerfully erotic to a lonely, disturbed boy who had few social skills. In his journal after he was released from the psychiatric institution, Massey wrote, "The system had one chance, so what can I say? It's not my fault. After reading all the shit in those 2 books, they had a reason to get a court order to get me some help." Then, out on his own, he seemed ambivalent. Should he resume his plans to find a girl to kill, or try to do something positive? That was a crucial moment of decision. Yet, as Fromm says, the only way to change from the destructive pole to the loving pole was to change one's foundational values. That did not happen for Massey. He continued to kill dogs, and soon he was back on drugs. For a time, he considered enlisting a killing partner, but decided that he'd probably just go it alone. He wanted to go to the Pacific Northwest, the land of Ted Bundy and the as-yet uncaught Green River Killer. He managed to get as far as Oregon in a friend of his mother's car, but the police caught them and sent them home. He lived with a woman for a while who kicked him out when he killed dogs in the house. She'd accidentally come across his journals and was horrified, inspiring him to a new resolution: never speak your true nature. With this instinct, he was consolidating his secret drive toward destruction. In 1992, he came close to realizing his dream of murder, but as he held a knife to a young girl as a prelude to rape, her mother came home, the same woman who had seen him kill the dogs, and ordered him to leave. He wrote in his journal that it was a momentous day for him. Later, he buried the girl symbolically at his secret altar in the woods. He looked forward to really losing his virginity as a killer. He wanted to physically eat some girl's brain and heart and drink her blood. He wanted bones to cry to him from the earth, bones of victims that belonged to him and him alone. The next year, when he shot Christina in the back, he told someone that he saw 3 angels leave her body. Then he spent many hours with his first kill looking at the body, cutting into it, removing and handling things. This, for him, was a truly powerful moment. He was a god. In fact, he'd written in his journal that females must die. It is written in Ezekiel 16:35. Bill Cox begins Born Bad with a quote from Jason Massey's journals that appropriately shows the workings of his mind. My life, it's been about chasing girls, finding the one to rape and kill. Rape is not enough. I must have a body for the next day or two to hold, talk to, and make love. Bones to talk with. Jason Eric Massey, entering a world where he had no control or security, found what he needed in images of death and destruction. His heroes had done so too. Thus, he's not unique, and there may be others like him, as yet uncaught, who feel a similar need to make their mark. Massey gave out plenty of signals, but those signals were largely ignored or dismissed, and because of that, 2 children died. James King called him the devil, but he didn't start out that way. He became that way. Jason Massey's case can teach us why we must pay attention to anyone's obsession with harm to others. It may be the first smoke arising from sparks that could eventually become a blazing fire.